Is this about the right volume? Okay. I've given a lot of talks since I became a professor, but I don't think I've ever given one with a microphone. So if I'm making some terrible mistake or there's some strange noise coming out of it, just raise your hand or throw something at me and let me know that it's unacceptable. So I know just what you guys wanted to hear. You've eaten, and so you're feeling kind of like you want to doze off. It's sort of towards the end of the week. Most of you are looking forward to not doing a whole lot of nothing or the football game later on. So just what you wanted to hear, an hour solid of history, right? Sounds fascinating. It's okay if some of you think history is a little bit boring. I'm not insulted. I'm an historian, so I disagree. But I think that part of the reason why sometimes people think history is a little bit dull is maybe we don't, when we teach history, make enough of an effort to demonstrate its relevance. We don't make it make sense to you and show you how really our history is who we are. In particular, world history. Now, this topic is actually what I really like. The Age of Empire is fascinating. But for many of you, maybe it might seem just a little bit distant. Well, understand that what makes this country different, what makes it unique, what makes it or separates it from just being another example of a Western European country is our diversity. Is that even in this room we have people from every part of the globe marbled together into a society with substantial contradictions, but also we derive strength from it. So, in many ways, the history of the Age of Empire is a lot like the history of the foundation of this country. And so when we look over a really long span of time, I think 500 years, what we're really studying is the history that underpins who each and every one of us happens to be, right? I know that oftentimes in this sort of, in a sort of competition-based context, a lot of what we do is fact-based. When I was in high school, I was in a bunch of academic teams, so I know that the memorization and remembering is a big part of what goes on, right?
Yep.
That's how you win. Right. To remember something, to really remember it, the best way to do it is to build connections in your brain, which is to say, sometimes people memorize things by making a song out of it, but this is something similar to that. What I'm going to present to you is a way of taking a lot of different facts about history over a really large sweep of time and how to keep them together, right? The connections between them, the tissue between them that makes it something coherent that you can all understand and maybe even remember a year from now or 2 years from now. That, more than any of the individual facts that you're going to memorize, may stick with you, may have something to do with the way you think about the world in a few years. So that's what I'm trying to do. Now, the Age of Empire is an enormous topic. Right? We're talking about somewhere in the area of about 400 years. It begins, by most people's reckoning, around 1,500 years ago. And we usually see the beginnings of the unraveling of European empires really after World War I and World War II. Right? So somewhere in the area of 450 years. So how do we make sense of that period of time, and how do we, at the same time, make it make sense to all of you guys? For us, and for me, anyway, one theme that I think runs throughout the whole of this period of time is the notion of what differentiates one person from another, one group of people from another. And that changes enormously from 1500 to the middle part of the 20th century. I put race and ethnicity as two terms that maybe most of us are familiar with. I could have put tribe there. We could have also discussed religion. But I think what we'll find is that during this period of time, how people decide, oh, those people are like us, or those people aren't like us, changes enormously. Right? It has a really important impact on more contemporary history. So, you've heard of each and every one of these terms: race, tribe, ethnicity. You're likely familiar with them, right? When you fill out a census data about yourself, you may be asked to say, I'm of a given race, or I am of a given tribe. Now, one of the problems, one of the pitfalls behind these concepts is that we tend to apply them as if they're extinct, as if they don't change, as if they don't have a history in and of themselves. One interesting question I think it's worthwhile asking is, for instance, has there always been such a thing as race? And one of the things I'm going to try to get across today is there hasn't been. That's a product of a very specific history. Right? In many ways, the history from 1500 to the 1900s is a history of moving from what I call here cultural chauvinism. In contemporary parlance, we call it ethnocentrism. What this really means is something pretty simple and not all that vicious, right? It means my culture, my people are more familiar, and I like them more than I like yours. This doesn't mean that I can't teach you our way of life. It doesn't mean that, for instance, you will always be condemned to be a lesser version of humanity. It's very different than subsequent understandings of a particular ethnicity, a particular race, and a particular tribe. Actually, the notion of tribe itself is kind of an important one. Right? How many of you watch CNN? You can raise your hand. Fox News, Times. All right. When we see conflict in the far-flung corners of the world, whether it's in the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or it's somewhere in East Central Africa, oftentimes the violence between different groups of people is described as tribal violence, isn't it? And that tribal idea, the notion of tribe as being something that's permanent, that's always been there, is actually a testament to the fact that we sometimes don't know how to think about other groups of people, how to make sense of them. The idea of tribe actually is one that's very specific and refers to only very particular moments in history. It actually referred to people pretty much outside of the Roman Empire and was written way back then. And it's probably most apt in its description of people from northern and Germanic peoples, Northern Europe and Germanic peoples during the Roman Empire. And yet it was used to describe people in Southeast Asia, Oceania, Africa, throughout most of this period of time from 1900, or from 1500 to 1900. So we're going to pull apart those terms today a little bit. Race didn't always exist. Right? Race is a way of differentiating between people dependent upon an observance of some sort of hereditary or biological difference. And so, to a very significant extent then, it needs at least the veneer, or at least what appears to be or some sort of science, right? It has to have at least the trappings of science. It is something that society decides, however. In actuality, the genetic difference between human beings is really, really tiny, right? And actually, if you compare us to other species, it's minute. And yet we make quite a lot of differences in our physical appearances. All right. Most of you have studied biology, right? Most of you had to learn about the classifications of all living things. You learned a really long term that you learned for a quiz called binomial nomenclature. Yeah, that might even be a quiz term, right? All right. Part of enlightened thought was scientific discovery. And the idea of classifying living things into hierarchies, whether they be butterflies or earthworms or elephants or human beings, is in and of itself not problematic, and wasn't problematic in the 18th century. What became problematic, and what's kind of interesting, is that humanity, according to a Western European view during the Age of Empire, ceased to be a series of side-by-side categories. Whether or not those categories made much sense, whether you're from Africa or from area north of China, or you were from Western Europe, just simply observing physical differences isn't a problem. Okay, what became problematic was then attributing cultural